And now it's time for a Geek Speak with GK Technologies, Sarah and Jodi.
In the fields again, I just can't wait to get in the fields again. The life I love is spreading potash for my friends, and I can't wait to get in the fields again. No, I can't wait to get in the fields again.
All right, so we are back again this week with that Geek Speak here, talking with Dr. David Franzen, Extension Soil Fertility Specialist here at NDSU, coming up on his 30th anniversary of being here in North Dakota. Last week, we had an excellent conversation about how he got started, where he's come from, how he got into actually being an extension fertility specialist, and also talking about the beginnings of precision agriculture and accounting for variability in fields.
So I think where we picked up last time, Dave, I think you were just graduating with your PhD. So what happened after you graduated with your PhD?
Well, I made another deal with my boss that I would go ahead and just be GM of the whole thing. But that was really hard because when you're working with an independent, somebody that's just family owned stuff, they can't help it but look over your shoulder all the time. And so I was there for maybe 6 months or something like that. And I interviewed at various places, and I a member of the American Society of Agronomy for a long time. I was one of the initial certified crop advisors. You know, my certified crop advisor number starts with 0, so I was one of that first group that came through, and I believe in that program very, very strongly. So, but it was very clear that my boss was going to sell, and so I got a newsletter at the time. It's called Agronomy News, and it had an advertisement from NDSU for a soil specialist, because my predecessors, Ed Vasey, there were two of them, two soil specialists before I came. They were totally extension, no research at all. Ed Vasey retired, I think, first, and then Carl Fanning, who's still alive, lives out the lakes, in his 90s, but he had retired, and so because of the buyouts and all that kind of stuff, they had to wait a year or so. But so this advertisement came up, and I saw where it was from, and I just laid it down. And so maybe the next day, Luann picks it up and said, "Did you see this job announcement?" I said, "Well, yeah, but did you see where it's from?" And she says, "Yeah, but it's you." And so I applied, and they brought me up. And when I got off the plane and after the interviews and stuff, I said, if Company X calls me and offers me a job, and NDSU calls me up and then asks me for a job, I'd go to NDSU in a second. That's the place. And so I came up here, had great mentors. Al Catnaw had the office right next door. He kind of nurtured me into the sugar beet world. Dwayne Berglund was the agronomist, extension agronomist. We rode around together all over the place. He knew everybody, knew their names, their kids, their wife, their whoever. He had a great memory. Jim Helm was the weed agronomist at the time, and we went out to beach once, driving 55 miles an hour all the way to the beach. And he showed me where he grew up. The house wasn't there anymore, but we just talked, and I just pumped these people for information. Another person that helped me a lot was Mike Sweeney, who's the only soil survey person was left on staff. They had a whole corral of people during that garrison diversion thing, because they needed to do a lot of mapping during that period of time. And so Mike was the remaining one, and he took me out a couple times on 2 days excursions. We just stopped and poked holes. I learned more about North Dakota soils during those few days with him than I probably learned since then. He was just, and I just asked him questions, and they didn't seem to be tired of answering them. So I just kept asking. But it was great. So a lot of the things I learned on those little trips were things that I pulled back in the past, and it helped make things make sense, like the Langdon region, the shaly soil, The salt gradient at Langdon, which name Calwar is using now in order to grade oats and barley and different crops for their salinity tolerance. That all came from those trips with Mike 20 some years ago. So anyway, when I started here, I didn't have an extension appointment, but it was total freedom from where I had been before. Because before, every day was a work day. I think the only sacred days of not work were Christmas and New Year's. Winter there is not like winter here. I mean, they call it winter in Illinois, but really it's just kind of a frosty mud. And so whenever it's firm enough to get out in the field, you're out there in the morning to do it. And so you're working every day, and of course you're working with the programs with the ag chemical companies and all that kind of stuff. You just have to be around, and the farmers decide to buy different days, and you better be around when they come in to purchase things or talk about things. So it's just like every day. So that was different because I had mostly weekends off. And then the other thing was that you could do whatever you wanted to do as long as you did your core job. I asked him about research and said, if you can get the money and do the research, go for it and still do your job. So I did.
So can I ask, Dave, if you didn't have an extension appointment when you first arrived at NDSU?
Oh, I did. I didn't have a research appointment.
Oh, you didn't have a research appointment. Okay, got it.
I'm still 100% extension. So I didn't have a research appointment, but they said if you get the money and whatever, you can do whatever as long as you're doing your extension kind of work, your education and outreach stuff. So I did. So they hired me despite and this is true, they hired me despite my corn and soybean experience. They took a deep breath and said, well, you'll learn the other stuff, which I did because I had great mentors. And they hired me in spite of my precision ag. He's passed away now, so I can just go ahead and say, but he talked to me after the interview, and he said, precision ag is never going to work in North Dakota. I said, okay.
Who said that?
John Morgan.
So I thought let's take a dive into this because I think this is really interesting. Like, what
wasn't John Morgan the guy that really did a lot of work on the sugar beet tops?
Yeah, so there was a paper in the '60s from a French experiment station, and it was referenced in who's that UK researcher that wrote the book on sugar beet nutrition. I can't remember what his name is anyway, but he and Morgan were pretty good friends, and so in this person's book he referenced Rixon and these two people, and so after I started working on the soil part of it, and actually working with Lance Reitmeyer and his master's degree to figure out why the beets had horrible quality up in St. Thomas area. So Joe Giles, who I worked with on the sugar beet crew, there was a sugar beet crew there. So Al Catnaugh was kind of the commander. I think they called him the general, if I recall. And then Joe Giles was the mild-mannered person that kept things in line. And then Alan Dexter was on the crew, and all the technicians were on the crew. Norm Catnaugh, of course. And so the beet people, American Crystal had a problem up in the St. Thomas area. They had horrible sugar content, and so and they were pretty sure that it might be too much nitrogen, but the farmers swore they never put on too much nitrogen. So anyway, they called us up and John Morgan up, and we were in a classroom in St. Thomas, and they were talking about their problems, and then they looked at me and Joe specifically, and they said, can you help us with this? And like John's on the other side of the room, and he's just steaming over there because they figured that they would ask him to do it, but they didn't. They asked us to do it. So we started working. They gave us money to do it. And, we had Lance Reitmeyer, who's a farmer up in the Fisher area, and the poor guy, he was my first master's student. I was just looking at his master's, and every time I look at it, I just feel horrible. It's it's like this thick.
For a
I mean, it could have
master's?
been 2 PhDs. I mean, we took whole fields and we sampled them at quarter-acre grids, 80-acre fields. And not only that, we took yields on 80-acre grids, and we took potato tops at 80-acre grids, and we took the sugar beet tops at 80-acre grids.
Was this all to like 4-foot depths too, or was
6.
oh god.
6 foot. We took them
Quarter-acre
6
grids
foot.
with 6-foot sampling.
So the last fall that we worked, we started out in the morning. We had potatoes to do. We had sugar beets to do. We had like 10, 12 people, 4 pickup trucks. We ran out of gas, had to get, the soil sampler was working all day and ran out of gas, and, had to refill with a gas can. We ended up sampling with the headlights on. We got back to Fargo like 1 or 2 in the morning.
Oh my gosh.
It was a marathon. The poor kid, but he finished his master's, and it's huge, but that all of his work, it really helped me understand extension, to try to do transformation in education, because these farmers were just adamant that they weren't putting on too much nitrogen. But what they were doing was they were neglecting the nitrogen that was in their leaves. And then Morgan came in later on, and he wrote those nice papers, and he did nice work with Kevin Horshauger as technician, and again substantiated that this nitrogen was really available to the beets, and that's where the really green and the yellow green and the yellow beets, that recommendation comes from him, not from me. But it was pretty clear there was a lot of deep end. There was a lot of nitrogen below 4 feet. In fact, we suggested and I think a few people really did sample to 6 feet to see if they really had that high mite. But there was like 200-300 pounds of nitrogen down in a 6 foot area. So huge, but since then they've drained that out, and once you drain it out, and then you consider the whole rotation instead of what you're doing to the beets, and everything is smooth sailing from then on. But to try to get over that hump, but it only took about 3 or 4 years of them doing that, and everything was fixed.
Because it really was about the nitrogen that was applied in the non-sugar beet year, like the rotational crops considered.
Yeah. And there were a lot of people that have potatoes in their rotation. The farmer I was working with had, let me see, what was it specifically? Well, it must have been beets, and then wheat, and then potatoes, and then back to, anyway, it was a three crop rotation with potatoes and small grains in there. And it's not all that uncommon up there, because St. Thomas is a great area to grow potatoes, because it's that fine sandy loam, and it's high in lime, and so the dirt just kind of falls off the potatoes as you're harvesting them. So it's a great potato area. But you can imagine 20-30 years ago the amount of nitrogen that people put on for potatoes. They didn't care. Put 300-400 pounds of nitrogen on.
If a little is good, more is better.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, what the heck? So
the missing piece of that was the deep nitrogen.
Yeah, the deep nitrogen was keeping them from because the sugar beets will root down. We dug pits out there, and we could find roots at least 8 foot deep, and they were still growing. So sugar beet roots go really, really, really deep.
Wow. So let's change the conversation a little bit. Let's ask about some of the research work that you've done with precision agriculture while you've been at NDSU. And I'm just going to start there. That's a really broad, open topic, and just kind of leave it. Dave, what would you like to talk about as far as it goes for projects that you've worked on and things that have really influenced precision agriculture?
Well, when I first started out, I started out with 2 40-acre fields. So I talked to Larry Swenson, who was in the lab, and I asked him, I said, I'm looking around for people, because I didn't know anybody up here. That first, I knew some people that I met at field days and things, but I needed some place where I could get to relatively quick. I didn't want to have a precision ag project starting out, west of Bismarck or something, because the travel would just kill you. But it's a long day doing sampling. So he suggested Lloyd Tilmoney near Valley City, and then he suggested a farmer, actually the wife, Ruth. She worked in the soil lab during the fall of the year. So why don't I talk to this person and see if he could work on a 40-acre field. So I had one near Gardner, just west of 94, just south of the Gardner exit, and then I had a 40-acre field on the Tilmoney farm, just southeast of their building site. And so I didn't do it in an 80-foot grid, but I did it at a quarter-acre grid. And I went down to 4 feet. So I divided the samples into 0 to 6, 6 to 24, and then 24 to 48, because the beet people are going down to 48 inches, and I got some of the money from the beet people and some of the money from EPA, and I can't remember who else I got money from. But so that's how I did the sampling in the fall of the year. So I did the geostatistics, I made the delineation, and there was a nice little horsehead pattern in the middle of the Valley City field. And I thought to myself when I saw it, I said, well, that's pretty cute. Too bad I'll never see that again, because my teachers at Illinois told me, yeah, you could sample for nitrate, but it's not going to be the same from year to year. And, things are going to change and you can't really rely on it too much. And that's certainly true in Illinois, but North Dakota is a different place. And so that was the first year. Because of my background, because of what I did with Peck, I thought it would be useful to do the second year also, to see what would happen. So the first year at Valley City, it was wheat, and then Lloyd put in sunflowers the next year. Just put a uniform application of nitrogen across the field and planted the sunflowers, had the sunflower crop. And then I went in to sample it again, just like I did before, and the same depths and everything. And I mapped everything out, and I looked at that picture, and there's the horse head in the middle. And I thought, oh my God.
2 years in a row.
It's like, that's not possible, but it happened. And it just kind of dawned on me that those patterns are there for a reason. There's some kind of logical reason. And that's when I started looking at what the reason was. And the main reason is the topography. It's the way the hills are and the swales and stuff. Then from there, I got a USDA and NASA grant, and we bought the Veris machine. That's still operational. It's out at Langdon now. And we have a new one here on campus that somebody else bought. You can see the patterns in the yield map. You can see the pattern in the aerial photography. You can see it in even the old Landsat, really horrible resolution satellite photographs that we used to have back in the 90s. That Lanny Filati worked with SatShot. And so you could just see it. So it's there for a reason. So all of a sudden, instead of having a sample an acre, which is exactly what you would need if you were going to do the grid to make those patterns, you could do the same thing with four zones that are delineated by these various tools, and that changed everything. So all of a sudden, precision ag became practical. Sarah, you've done sample an acre. You know how hard that is.
It's character building.
Yeah, it is, and it would be very expensive too.
Very expensive.
And people wouldn't do it every year. You couldn't physically do it every year, and you couldn't afford it every year, but you could certainly do the zones.
And that is certainly true, especially as you move further west in North Dakota. The fields in North Dakota are larger compared to fields as you go into some of the states to the east. Certainly, I've worked with some fields that are a section in size, and you go west to western North Dakota and even into Montana, and there's places out there where we can run into some people with 1,000-acre fields, and you break that down into 7 zones, and they're like, wow, that's a lot of zones. It's 1,000 acres.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So at that time, was there any discussion of zones? What was zones a thing? And how was anybody talking about that as breaking into fields that way versus doing it just as a applied man-made grid over fields to pick up that variability?
The only suggestion of that, and they never followed through, was the work by Pennock up in, was it Alberta or Saskatchewan? One of the prairie provinces. They had a paper on fertility patterns in hummocky terrain. And so they wrote a series of papers on it, but they never really pursued it. I think if they would have pursued it, but I just thought, I think they thought it was just kind of a curiosity and never really put the connection to it. This could be economically advantageous, which is one of the great things about being an extension researcher, because you always have the end in sight. You're not really looking at the paper as being the end. You're looking at what can you do, and the paper is just a pain in the butt that you have to do for tenure and stuff. No, I'm serious. I mean, how many papers have people wrote, and they sit on the shelves, and yeah, they're cited by other researchers, but farmers don't know anything about these and could probably couldn't care less. So when I'm doing work, people ask me, well, why didn't you do this? And I said, well, I suppose I could have written a paper, but what difference would it make, with any kind of recommendation? And they just kind of look at me, but that's that's how I feel.
So you were really concerned about making sure that the work that you were doing was applicable in the field and would really help the farmers out.
Yeah. When I was out as a manager, agronomist, whatever it is, you have those day-to-day issues that come up and you want answers for them. And sometimes people just really aren't interested in work to try to get answers, or on a different wavelength somehow.
And so you look at this Tillmany field and you're like, okay, there are zones here. There are management zones that we could treat. Or like we know there's variability here that's split up by area.
And it's
What's the-
happening consistently.
And it's happening consistently. What's the next step of like taking this concept and helping farmers implement this in the field once you've got this idea in your head and you see the data that backs up your idea?
So I just started talking about it at meetings. One of I think the great breakthroughs was Glenn Hansen. So Glenn calls me up one day, and so we meet at the Holiday Inn and we have breakfast, and he wants to start this company, and he really, was wondering about this zone approach and how many zones in the field and what would you look for and all this kind of stuff. And we talked for a couple hours, and he started this company, and that was really the first kind of successful thing that was going out in the country. But he used the zone approach. He probably used more zones than I would have recommended, but I'm not going to I would never take him to task over that. I just, I think what he did was revolutionary to get behind it and to such a degree. And so it not only takes the extension, but it takes the industry buy-in, the consultant buy-in to get it to work out. I remember conversations with Dave Willis, who's retired now up at Thief River Falls, and others about, maybe this being at the case. And there was some reluctance to kind of start out, but once they kind of got into it, they kind of proved to themselves that maybe this thing would work. And so they started to pursue it.
It is really neat that zones have taken off. And quite honestly, zone management is very successful in North Dakota. Do you have any reasons why you think zones versus grids might be a better fit here versus Illinois, and or do grids have a fit here in North Dakota in some sort of way, shape, and form?
So when I first started out, I didn't want to discount grids totally here, and I still don't, because in fields that maybe have been heavily fertilized, let's say that farmer X decides that he wants to do build-up maintenance. Not sure why a person would want to do build-up maintenance, but there are some farmers that do that. And so they're heavily fertilized with P and K. And so at least for the P and the K, the grids under a really heavily fertilized situation like that, or where there's manure history of some heavy applications of manure, the grid approach is probably going to identify areas better than zones, because the zone lines have been swallowed up by high rates of fertilizer and manure. When I look back in all of my fields in Illinois, I know some fields that would have benefited greatly from zones. There was one farmer that I worked with, West of Rantoul, that he had a large part of his farm that was an old swampy area, and you could still see the little shellfish shells in the soil. It was a harpster soil, and it wasn't just a little bitty place. It was maybe 80 acres of this field. It was very clearly this harpster soil. And he said, I know when you take these samples, the P is going to be very low and the pH is going to be really high. So why don't you just do a composite of that area? And I said, no, I'm introducing, so this is my schooling coming in. No, you're introducing bias into it. We don't want to do that. And he said, but this is what you're going to see. And I said, well, yeah, you're probably right. But, so if I went back there and I've told the guy, I told him, I said, you were right. And I was wrong. That if I was going to do it today, I would do exactly what you told me to do. And then up by Kankakee, Lake Michigan used to be a lot larger than it is right now, and so there's dunes. They're the old remnant dunes like we have around the valley. There's remnant dunes up there, and so it just drive me crazy. I was working for a company, and it, so many steps between this sample and that sample. And you go over a hill, start out in tall corn on the bottom, really short corn on the top, and then you go down into the ridge, and a really tall corn again. And you take another sample. It's like, dang, I really feel like I should be taking samples on that ridge too. Like, no, you're introducing bias into it and blah, blah, blah. And so that'd be another area where I'd certainly go to zones. That just screams zones. So there are areas in Illinois that probably benefit from zones, but because of the rich history of build-up maintenance that have just overwhelmed any kind of natural currents. When we did that Illinois work, Ted stopped people from putting on fertilizer from 1988 on. And as the years went on, each year you started to go a little bit closer to the natural boundaries of the P and the K that you saw back in the 60s or in the Thomasboro field in 1982 when he started out, before they started putting on huge amounts of fertilizer. So as you draw down, you start to see those boundaries appear again. But as long as the person is putting on at least as much fertilizer as you're taking off, you won't see them. But you do see them with lime. And then when Antonio Mallarino, who's retired now at Iowa State, when he did his work to investigate grids or zones, he found that the zones were better at defining the field for lime and for K, and grids were better for P.
So I have an interesting scenario with a customer that I've been chatting with about grids and zones, and it's an interesting scenario. So he's an avid zoner, mostly standard, quarter section size fields, 5 zones, but in a lot of the red zones, the low productivity zones, he's concerned about issues with pH, and he's actually curious about gridding some of the low productivity areas where the average soil sample coming out of that zone might be having indications of low soil pH, maybe lower phosphate, maybe lower potassium, but definitely pH is tending to be the bigger issue. What do you think of a crazy concept of gridding a zone?
Sure. I think there's variability within the zone. It's usually minor, but that doesn't mean that it's always that way. So yeah, I mean, I especially just doing it, once just to see. But I would, I'd probably, because of the interest there, I'd probably sample it at that sample and acre size and see what kind of variation you have. But I think that's totally fine. There are sometimes those delineation lines with the zone are fuzzy, that they grade from one to the other, but other times they're very abrupt. There were a couple places in one of the sites that I worked with in Illinois where within like 10 feet the pH changed from like 7.8 to 5.6.
Wow.
Just really abruptly for some reason. I don't know why. He doesn't know why. The Air Force owned it at one time. God knows what they did out there.
And I think that's what we're seeing too in some parts of Western North Dakota is like, I know Kyle Oki, who's an agronomist out by Dickinson, he's got some of these fields that have, hilltops that are sandy and they're low productivity because they are, of course, very drier than the other soil in Western North Dakota, but also they're sandy and they've got this low CEC and they can't buffer pH very well. So these hilltops, even though we'd expect, in a typical prairie profile that as you get farther down into like the BK horizon, you might have a higher pH as you're getting more calcium carbonate. But he's finding that these hilltops are actually the lowest part, or like the lowest or most acidic soils in these fields. It's kind of like North Dakota is so interesting, right? Because we don't have these limestone quarries. So we have to be very, very thrifty with our lime usage. And so it's a game of, reading the landscape, figuring out where the bad zones are, and then figuring out, is it bad because it's dry, or is it bad because we have a pH problem that might be going on?
Or a salinity issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because the two may or may not come together. They may or may not go together.
Yeah. I mean, that's like for us using NEMS. I mean, that's the beauty of having a mod area, right? You can go in and say, these are both red areas, but I've got an area next to a slough that's red because of salinity versus a hilltop that's red because it's dry.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
So I'm gonna try to take the. I was really excited to have that conversation about zones and grids with you. Super excited about that. And we could go on and on forever. I've got way more questions, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask about your work with optical, optical sensors either, because well aware that you've done a ton of work with those with sensors. And so can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done with active optical sensors and how you see that fitting in with mainstream agriculture or crop fertility management?
So my first summer, August '94, I was invited by Farmland to Kansas City with my compatriots in the Great Plains, and I got to meet Bill Ron, and it's my first meeting with Bill Ron. We had an argument. So he was talking about his prototype green seeker and how it's when it's more yellow, that's where you put on more nitrogen. And so my question was the same question that I've received many times since then: is just because it's yellow doesn't mean that's nitrogen. It could be, and I spouted out a lot of different things. And he says, well, yeah, you're right, but we have a nitrogen sufficient strip. He called it an enriched strip. And so when in the same soils and the same varieties and stuff like that, I mean, we just went back and forth. We became really, really good friends. And so when was it? It was 2-3 years after that. Before they sold before Oklahoma State sold the company to somebody, um, he came up and gifted us a green seeker. And so I started using it in my nitrogen rate trials. I was starting to do nitrogen rate trials that worked with the beets for time with it, and small grains and corn and sunflowers and things. But anyway, the first green seeker I got was from Bill directly. He came up and showed us how to use it. A nice picture of him with Jay Goose and myself and Joni in the lab and Larry Swenson in the lab, and so I used it, but I didn't really come up with any algorithms until after we did the work with it was like 2013, 14, something like that. But it's really kind of my great failing. If you look at all the data we accumulated after all those years, and not just mine, but Bill's and others that worked in the country. Bill had a lot of grad students because Oklahoma State the state of North Dakota, or Oklahoma has a fertilizer checkoff, and he always had like 10 graduate students. So he's got graduate students scattered all over the country, and all of them are deeply immersed in all the active sensors. There's books on it, 1,000 papers about it. Oklahoma had a huge extension effort that Brian Arnell led, who's now the main person at Oklahoma State, and trying to work with farmers. And I asked Brian last year. I said, with all the extension work that you directed directly toward this and working with farmers and everything, what percentage of the wheat acres in Oklahoma use this? And he said 10%. So the area that started with, and all that effort, and all those fields, 10%. So how many do we have that use it? Zero.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not very many, but
It's not very many. So anyway, you'll enjoy the crop and pest report article that's going to come out tomorrow, because I have a little jibe at the very end of it about okay, so we've lost a lot of nitrogen. We're going to lose a lot of nitrogen from Christine to Hillsboro. This is what you should have done, and now you get to guess.
So
Yeah. And I did 6 years of intensive research and came up with algorithms, so you didn't have to guess. But guess what? You have to guess.
we have the data. You've collected all this data. What are the barriers to getting this implemented at the field level?
Okay, so how much extra time do you guys have on your hands to help farmers to work that out?
You know, it's a really interesting question. And I thinking about the role that I played in retail agronomy when I worked in ag retail, thinking about my role when I was an independent crop consultant, I didn't have a lot of extra time, especially right now, to to figure that out. You know, in
Yeah,
this time frame of
it's
May
yeah.
and June, everything is happening, and I didn't.
Hmm.
And so the question is how do we fill that? Because the irony is with the job that I do now with GK Technology, you know, my focus is software sales and servicing that software, but then also helping to create maps that make good agronomic sense and helping other people understand how to do that. But kind of once the prescriptions for spring are in the tractor, there's a little bit of a lull right now. And so it'd be interesting to see if there's a way to try to, you know, work with some of these other technologies and see what could happen going forward.
But I think that's the log jam. So when I first got the corn algorithm together, we were just so excited because it was really nailing it. So I invited Darren and Kelly down for breakfast, and I gave them the whole spiel, and I expect them to say, "Well, this is really exciting. We're just gonna," and they just looked at me. But I get it. I understand. They're totally covered up with doing what they're doing, and it's not like you got 100 extra people there just sitting around wanting to do something. I get it. I understand. And I think someday this is going to go off, and at least the base algorithms are there to help people along the way. We got it. We have algorithms in the corn for 4 to 8 leaf corn, 4 to 6 leaf corn, and then wheat for 4 to 6 leaf wheat, and then we also have the post anthesis guidance with using the red edge with the Holland, because the green seeker doesn't have a red edge that's worth anything. At least it didn't. Maybe it does now. Now that they've sold from Trimble to somebody else, maybe that company will be more interested in it. But I think Trimble just made all their money on the GPS side of things. That this ag thing was just kind of a poor sideshow. But they really need to. I always thought that instead of buying Climate Core, if Monsanto would have bought Holland Scientific or Trimble, that things would be a lot different now. But
Hmm.
they didn't.
So it really sounds like this is a missed opportunity for a lot of us in agriculture. And I also wonder too, like, is it just that nitrogen is just so easy and not, I mean, it's not cheap, right? Urea and anhydrous are still expensive products, but it almost seems like it's just easier to apply too much and then not worry about having some loss, or like applying more to account for some potential loss and then just going, then having to worry about figuring out an algorithm and doing the sensing.
And taking the time.
Yeah.
The world is a lot different now than it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I would have said, yeah, that's exactly right. But there's the pressure to keep the nitrogen out of the water isn't going away. What was it? Just a week ago or something like that? That a story from the Des Moines Register hit the Washington Post, which is always a bad thing, and talking about the chemicals from agriculture destroying fishing habitat in the Gulf of Mexico. And I mean, it was really written a very harsh. It was a very harsh article against agriculture. Des Moines Register is kind of known for that, but frankly, there's a lot of people that have that mentality, and it's not going away. And so, getting on the front end of it and doing the right thing and not putting on extra when you don't need it, all of those things are, I think important. I'm not a regulator. I'm an educator. I don't like the regulation, but there are a lot of people that aren't going to be reluctant to pass a law.
Kind of on that same subject, same thought process of what future regulation may or may not be. And taking that question in a different direction, where do you see the future of precision ag now that you've spent your whole career in agriculture and soil fertility and variable rate and seeing this across, from kind of basically conception to where it is now? Where do you see precision ag going in the next 30 years, or maybe even just the next 5, 10, 20?
Well, farmers have embraced it, and farmers want it, and so I think they'll continue to want it, and I think the demand for it will continue to increase. And frankly, the move toward larger and larger farm size just screams for it to keep going. It's the smaller, older farmers that are going to sell the land or rent it out or something like that to somebody bigger. I mean, that's going to continue, and the people that come on are going to need help with that size drag. I mean, they have a size advantage when they're buying things, but on the management side, the precision agriculture helps them to keep the productivity that the smaller farmers may have had because of seeing all the acres all the time and not just having a hired man see all the acres all the time. So I think that's going to drive it. Another log jam is just to get the right to get people that are skilled out in the field that can help with the support. There are a lot of companies see so of course everybody got hit with the solar flares and all that kind of stuff, and so you can't help that. But other people got hit. There was an advertisement somewhere out in the western part of North Dakota for a precision ag technician. And that advertisement went for months. As far as I know, maybe it's still going on. It's really hard to get people out in the field that have these kind of skills, and so having people that have skills that can work with these things and talk to do the basic like John Mann did when he worked with Online IFS, getting things to talk to each other and making sure that things are compatible. Just because they say it's compatible doesn't mean it is compatible. And
That's job security
so
for us.
yeah, so getting people to understand that kind of thing and they're willing to work with it and have that farmer interface. I think it's really tough. You guys know that. So there's any number of computer science people out there that wouldn't know agriculture from anything, and so you have to have the background in both really to be able to work with this. I'm not going to say anybody can program. My son would shoot me if I said that, but there's a lot more people that know how to program than they are to work with farmers and to work with the equipment and get it all to go. So it's a special skill, and I think maybe places like the School of Science, the Lake Region, places like that, Bismarck State College, maybe have the opportunity to kind of work that in their program and get people excited about doing this because I think it would be a high paying job. Yeah, it's out in the hinterland, but there's nothing really wrong with the hinterland either. I kind of like looking at antelope and bison and cows and stuff like that too, and the landscape. There, so that'll be a hill that needs to be climbed, is to try to get people because some farmers themselves aren't really able to do it themselves, and so they need somebody to help them out in the neighborhood that they trust, and then the dealerships, the farmers want somebody to be able to apply it site specifically, but the local co-ops or the local suppliers just don't have the horses to do it, and so building that up. But I think the demand will remain strong. I think it's just kind of part of life. When I first started out, when I started talking about the zones and stuff, I said, this seems like kind of a space age kind of thing, but before too long, this will just be part of your life, and you couldn't even imagine life without it. 40 years ago, would farmers even think about auto steer? And now, my God, when that thing goes apart and they start driving crooked and everything, they're just beside themselves. They stop the planter and they won't start it again until it starts up again.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that. We certainly saw the evidence of that during that last solar storm. I mean, planters were actually physically shutting down and the planting conditions were good, but they couldn't drive straight.
It speaks to the added efficiencies of having auto steer. I mean, it's not just the driving straight part, but better weed control, more efficiency, getting more seeds per acre and not crossing paths. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it.
Don't have the carryover, don't have the
Yes.
overlap, and with all this pothole country, it's not a square
Yeah.
section. You got things you have to drive around, and it helps a person.
And to your point about the zones, that really is becoming standard. Dealing with customers now don't have to necessarily explain what zones are. I do a lot of explanation about what the difference between grid sampling and zone sampling is so that people can have a frame of reference. But when people are talking about zones, they're now when they call up and they want people want to call up, they want zones made, and it's about the quality of the zones. It's no longer just having a zone in your hand, it's actually having a quality zone. And that's a different conversation than what we were having 5 years ago. So that's kind of exciting. So I do think zones and precision soil sampling is really taking off, and it is definitely changing the way things are being done.
Yeah.
So
This is an excellent place to end the conversation. We appreciate so much the time that you allowed us to share this morning. I know I learned a lot. I think Sarah learned a lot too.
it was
Hopefully all
a
of
fun
our
conversation.
Yes. Hopefully all of our listeners did too. But thank you so much for the insight and for a history and a primer of grid and zone sampling and just the concept in general. And thank you for your service in North Dakota. We're really going to miss you when you retire. So hopefully one day you might consider coming back to the podcast too.
So, and I do think it's important to really
know.
emphasize the thanks for the work that you've done for North Dakota and North Dakota agriculture. You know, your fingerprints are all over the way that fertilizers and soils are managed in this state. So, and beyond. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. But I think we have a very young soil department now, and I'm really excited. They have a great skill set. My successor, Brady Gadel, will be terrific, and so I have great hope for the soils department, and I think it'll be a great help for people in the state and the region.
Fantastic. Thank you again. And remember, with GK Technology, we have a map and an app for that.
No, I can't wait to get in the fields again.
Let the geeks at GK Technology help you with your agricultural data. Their agronomists know agriculture. When it comes to creating soils and zone maps to maximize yields in your fields, you can trust the people with decades of experience in site-specific agriculture. Everyone at GK Technology has a background in agriculture, so they know what makes a farm run, and they speak your language. The geeks at GK Technology have a map and an app for that.